Well, I think we might be ready to kick off with the intro so everybody can get settled in the room, in particular for our speakers. I would like, hello and welcome to those who are actually attending in Geneva in the room. I can see you, and the others that are connected remotely as myself. You're joining the session of Resilience through Sustainability, Rethinking the Multilateral System Post-COVID to Deliver for Trade and People. This session is organized by the European Economic and Social Committee, the ESC. My name is Tanja Butzek, and I am the chair of the ESC Trade Follow-up Committee. The ESC is a consultative body to the EU institutions. We are comprised of 329 members coming from the EU 27 member states. We do have a 5-year mandate. And of course, the members are comprised of business groups or trade union groups, as myself, but also a large diversity of civil society groups. And we are the voice of the organized civil society in Europe, but in particular, we do have the possibility, of course, to give our recommendations to the EU institution on each and every legislative proposal. And we have the opportunity also to do own initiative opinions, and we have a rather notorious record to do them also on trade. Only on Tuesday, we have adopted a recent opinion on the trade and sustainable development chapters of the EU trade agreements, giving rather ambitious recommendations. So with that very brief intro of the second, please let me do a bit of housekeeping. I know, of course, with the distance, it's all going to be a challenge. I'm going to invite and introduce our speakers one by one when they are going to take the floor. But of course, I would also like to invite questions from your side, from the audience. And please feel free to join us on the platform. I think by now you're very much familiar with how to post your questions. For those who are in the room, ideally, if you have your laptop with you, please post them also through the portal. And if not, just like we do it the old-fashioned way, write your question on a piece of paper, and my colleague at the panel to the very left, then we'll make sure that the question will reach me on WhatsApp. So we do have a bit of digital trade involved. Anyway, when posting your questions, please make sure to identify who you would like to have answering your question, but please also keep them short and concise, because then it will make it much easier for me to loop in the questions during the debate. So I think with that, I have actually flagged all the necessities of technical stuff for starting our session. Now we can focus on the content. I myself have followed a couple of sessions since the beginning of the public forum, and I personally feel very much encouraged by the topic of our session, because it seems to be, around in the air of a couple of sessions, that we are going all into the same way. I mean, we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, this really had put a spotlight on the shortcomings of the multilateral system. I mean, we have seen in particular global supply chains being heavily hit. And the point that we would like to stress, of course, is how we can bring the various elements of environment, of labor, and trade together to really then also to strengthen and to boost each other, and by no means to undermine. And I think this is for the overall quest for sustainability, of course. But the point that I also wanted to stress, that the term resilience has been again floating in the air in all the discussions that, of course, we are now hearing post-COVID. But we all have to be aware that this is nothing that we can switch on and off like that. So we would like to follow in this session the idea of bringing resilience through sustainability, actually bringing the elements of environment, labor, social rights, and trade together in one basket, as I would like to call it, to reinforce each other. We'd also like to explore with our panel and with a lot of expertise that we have managed to bring together, what is the role of WTO in there, in particular when it comes to the design of a new multilateral system. As I had mentioned, I would like my panelists to help me a bit setting the further scene, and I would like to start with Ambassador Stephen de Boer. You're the Canadian permanent representative to the WTO. And as such, of course, you have a lot of insight into the complexity of bringing those three components that I had described together. But even more so, you do have a very strong record when it comes to Canada's international climate change negotiations. And therefore, I would like to put forward a question to you in the sense that we seem to have now environmental issues featuring more prominently in the trade arena, also in the WTO, even with some institutional backing and structural backing. So my question to you, Ambassador, is, has environment arrived in the trade arena and at the WTO? And maybe perhaps to add, what was the winning strategy to get there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me try to address that question, but first, hopefully through my remarks. But if you don't feel I've adequately touched on that, then I'm happy to come back. But I'm very pleased to be here to discuss the role of the WTO in delivering sustainable trade and to touch on how trade can help support the achievement of the sustainable development goals. And you, Tanya, mentioned climate change, and I will touch on that as well. This is an important discussion for us to be having in the run-up to the ministerial conference, MC12, as WTO members discuss the priorities of the organization for the coming years. And there's been a growing recognition over the past few years that the world of trade can no longer be considered and small islands separated from other policy spheres. And Tanya, you discussed this well in your introduction. And trade is a broad subject that it touches on areas like environment, gender, and labor. And as we build the rules for the future of trade, it's important that we consider the interactions between these issues. It's also important to recognize that trade can be a valuable tool in enhancing the prosperity of all countries, bringing them the wealth and resources that they need to achieve their development goals in a sustainable manner. The WTO can play a critical role in ensuring that trade, development, and environmental objectives and policies are mutually supportive. And while there are those who used to argue that issues like environment and gender had no place at the WTO, there's been a growing recognition among the membership of the value that the WTO can bring to global efforts to address the challenges that we face. Today, these issues are being ever more integrated into the work being done on trade. Of course, there's much more to be done, and the WTO, driven by members, is gradually developing new tools to advance these issues. On environment, members have come together to build on the longstanding work at the Committee on Trade and the Environment to engage on a number of environmental issues. The broad range of these discussions is a testament to the level of interest among the membership. It is clear that members see a role for the WTO in tackling environmental challenges, and it's been a pleasure to see this work accelerate over the last few years. As we prepare for MC12, I am hopeful that we will see a broader range of members coming forward to indicate their support for the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, or what we call here in Geneva, TESTI. Over the past year, members have come forward to raise many areas of interest which are highly relevant to the discussion on sustainability. We've also had the opportunity to have detailed exchanges on some of these issues and to explore how different members are addressing sustainability challenges. Finding areas of common interest for members will be a key to advancing work across all of the environmental discussions. As we move beyond MC12, the next challenge will be to turn the discussions into concrete action so that we can begin to deliver positive outcomes. This is an area where I think that stakeholders can provide strong value in the process. Trade policy experts can benefit from the different perspectives that NGOs, the private sector, and international organizations bring to the table. They have experience with different modes of action and business models, which may be useful points of reference to the trade policy world. This cross-pollination is highly valuable, and we are keen to continue the discussions that we have started in TESTI. MC12 has provided members with a timeline and a target to set out our goals, but it is not the end of the process. We have an opportunity to demonstrate that the world of trade and the WTO more specifically can contribute to global efforts to combat climate and environmental sustainability challenges that the world faces today. And as we move beyond MC12, it is my hope that the continued efforts by members will begin to yield tangible results in the area of trade and sustainability. And thank you very much for the opportunity to engage with participants today, and I look forward to your questions during the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. This actually very well had set also the scene with the larger overview from various other elements that are now featuring more prominently in the trade arena. I would now like to bring in our second panelist, Karen Curtis. She is the Deputy Director at the ILO, but also chief of the Freedom of Association branch within the ILO. Of course, this is a very important element for us from the trade union side, if I might highlight that. Karen, now we have heard, I would say, a rather encouraging and positive story when it comes to the narrative of environment and trade. I think the story is a bit more complex and a bit more difficult when it comes to labor issues. So my question to you would be, how can we actually promote the element of labor and social rights in trade agreements? What is your assessment of the current situation, and where do you see the role of the ILO in that matrix? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you for your questions, which, as the previous speaker, I may address in my remarks or afterwards also in follow-up. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with this illustrious panel, rethinking the post-COVID multilateral system to deliver for trade and people. And I'd like to focus my brief intervention on three main messages: breaking down silos to make trade work for all, embracing the rules for a fair and level playing field, and the critical importance of institutional cooperation. So breaking down the silos, and here I would like to also not separate the silo of environment and labor. The dialogue surrounding the nexus between labor standards and trade has grown over the last 3 decades. In recent years, accelerated attention to this nexus has fostered critical research and debate, giving rise to an emerging call for a more holistic approach to social, trade, financial, economic, and environmental policies. Supporting this, and fueled by the profound effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on economic and social development, the tripartite constituents from the ILO's 187 member states firmly embraced a call to action on a human-centered approach to recovery that is inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. They recognize the critical importance of trade and investment policies in promoting decent work, environmental sustainability, and sustainable enterprises throughout the value chain. This call, I believe, sets the stage for a coordinated, multifaceted approach to make trade work for people. A holistic approach means ensuring also a place for environmental sustainability in the trade and labor nexus dialogue. The coordinated action needed to address climate change and protect the environment will necessarily have a transformative impact on society, and its effectiveness is dependent on a strong social consensus. To achieve this, the dialogue around environmental sustainability must be managed in ways that maximize the opportunities for decent work, reduce inequalities, promote social justice, and support those negatively impacted. In recognition of the crucial synergies between green jobs and decent work, the ILO has been tasked by the UN Secretary General to lead the Climate Action for Jobs initiative, to promote coherence in achieving a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. But no recovery can be sustainable or resilient if it is not inclusive. The referencing of ILO fundamental principles and rights in trade agreements bears witness to the demand for rebalancing of any unequal effects of trade, leveling the playing field and ensuring that all those who toil in the production and delivery of goods do so in conditions of freedom and respect for human dignity. Inclusive also means ensuring a conducive environment for their collective voice as a critical enabler for the achievement of decent work and the vital contribution it can make to building forward better. And in this respect, I welcome the remarks from His Excellency the Ambassador about bringing those players also to the table to have a more inclusive dialogue. Trade policies that recognize and support these ends are vital to confronting the current challenges. The ILO, for its part, plays a key role in coordinating decent work objectives and providing the capacity building necessary. It supports research, development, cooperation, dialogue, and engagement to build the foundations for well-rounded trade and investment policies. In this respect, the ILO recently published guidance tools for assessing quantitative and qualitative labor market indicators linked to trade, and developed methodologies to assess the impact of trade on labor at the macro and micro levels, expanding the knowledge tools in order to evaluate whether trade is delivering to its promise. In the area of development cooperation, trade policy has recognized the ILO's normative agenda as a benchmark for guidance and bolstered the support that the ILO can give to countries to ensure fair and equal treatment and make trade deliver for decent work. On the ground, cooperation is coupled with multiple interventions to raise awareness or heighten engagement of all tripartite constituents on responsible business conduct, the just transition, and the green economy. The call for coordinated action and policy coherence at the international level, most recently affirmed by its constituents, has been repeatedly echoed throughout the ILO's constitutional history, reinforcing its mandate to ensure that trade is supportive of social justice. The world needs a coherent message that a fair and open trading system and stronger investment in the decent work agenda complement each other and provide important synergies for broad-based progress in living standards, full employment, and sustainable development. The ILO stands steady in its commitment to promote a holistic and coherent multilateral approach to support these critical synergies. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you and your thoughts on how we can together develop further this ambitious agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. In particular, also highlighting the role that the ILO can take, in particular, in that better institutional cooperation. And I would like to turn to our third panelist, Emmanuelle Boutou-Stoups. She is the Secretary General of the French Committee to the International Chamber of Commerce, ICC. But I would like to particularly welcome her as a former colleague of the ESC, where she actually had drafted many trade-related opinions, also with link to the WTO. I myself was a member of many of the study groups. So therefore, I think it is very important to bring also the side from the business experience and together and bring into that debate. And maybe perhaps let me start with the introduction of my question in the sense, because I do know that you do have a very strong record also in particular in the garment sector, and therefore very much familiar also with the challenges that in the supply chains. And I know that you always have been advocating in particular for a multilateral coherence of those rules. So bringing it like from the ground level of business and the engagement on supply chains. So what has to happen then at the multilateral level to ensure that coherence? Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Sorry for that. So I would like to share with you some of the proposals that we have gathered in an opinion adopted by the ESC last July. So of course, the ESC represents the European civil society. And you know that the EU in its trade policy has a very strong ambition precisely to reconcile the various dimensions of globalization, not only, of course, the economic and trade dimension, but also the environment and labor dimension. So in this opinion, our feeling at that time, and I don't think that now, 15 months later, the assessment is different, is that we are in a situation with the COVID-19 emergency in which we need a kind of unprecedented effort at international level to redefine, to redesign the multilateral system. it is very important that we should rethink the global governance rules. We need to be innovative. We need to be ambitious. And when you look at the history of the 20th century, we know that after each big crisis, after each world war, there was a spectacular effort to renew the multilateral rules. So the idea will be really to think about what could be a new matrix, a new multilateral matrix, because in this word matrix, and of course this word has different meanings in different disciplines. We can think about biology or mathematics, but you will have the same characteristics. We need a kind of substance in which structures are embedded. We need an organizational structure that will foster greater flexibility. So in a nutshell, we need to break down the silos, it has been said by Karen. We need to bridge, we need to put in place more cooperative processes, cooperation spirits between the various multilateral institutions. And in particular, in this opinion, we have worked on what can we do in order to foster cooperation between the WTO, between the ILO, and between the UNFCCC. So I will just give you some examples of the kind of recommendation we have been able to draft together, meaning employers, trade unions, and other interests of the European civil society. First of all, we would like, we know, of course, that we would like to integrate the WTO into the UN system from a functional point of view. The WTO Director General takes part in the UN Chief Executive Board with all the Director Generals of the specialized agency. And we would like very much that this instance will help to have a more systemic and horizontal views of the multilateral challenges. On the other hand, how to put a bridge between the labor standards and the work of the ILO and the work carried out by the WTO. At the ESC, we are supporting, for instance, the fact that the WTO should grant the ILO a former observer status, not only as a matter of reciprocity, but really we do think it will be more useful than ever after the terrific social effects of the pandemic crisis. Then we have another proposal, and we know that the members of the WTO are the same countries that are the signatories of the Paris Agreement. So these countries, in order to be in compliance with the Paris Agreement, they have to put in place climate measures. Some of them will have an impact on the domestic market, but some of them may have an impact on trade. And here, of course, I'm referring to the various mechanisms of carbon border adjustment. How can we be sure that these climate measures at the border will be in compliance with WTO? Will it be possible for the WTO to have a kind of a definition of what is a climate measure that is trade restrictive? What is a climate measure in compliance with the Paris Agreement and its commitment, which will not be considered as trade restrictive? And I think that this debate, this brainstorming debate, it's now really urgent, because we know that some major regions in the world will reflect and maybe will put in place in the next months CBAM. Of course, I'm referring to the current proposal of the European Commission table last 14th of July. And in this exercise of building this new multilateral matrix, we do think that the EU is well positioned to do so, because in the Article 21 of the Treaty on European Union, one of the duty is to promote an international system based on a stronger multilateral cooperation and good global governance. So we do think that it is a task on which the EU can deliver a lot. And I can maybe come back later on the supply chain and to give you concrete examples, but maybe later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. In particular, also now already coming up with very concrete recommendations and proposals. I would now like to loop in our fourth speaker, Ignacio Garcia Becerro, who is director at the European Commission at DG Trade. He is in charge of multilateral affairs, and of course, he has been around for a very long time. He has led the EU in many bilateral negotiations. I myself only joined when you negotiated the TTIP, and that's when we actually met for the first time. So you have a lot of recollection of what had happened before and also in the multilateral sphere. I would like to sort of to round up the discussion or the intros and setting scene. The EU has, of course, a long-standing record on bringing in sustainability issues into the bilateral trade arena. It's like the Korea Agreement is now, it's like 10 years anniversary. So we do have a lot of experience when it comes to that line. The EU had also, beginning of this year, adopted a new trade strategy, where in particular putting a lot of focus on elements like sustainability, on assertiveness. Even though we might disagree on the enforcement angle, but this is not for today's debate. But nevertheless, how would you see, after having heard like from the previous speakers on environment, on labor, but also the proposals on the institutional bringing together, what would be, let's say, the challenge to be faced at the multilateral level that we can bring into our good experience, even though there's always room for improvement on our trade and sustainability chapters, into the linkage into the multilateral arena and into the WTO? Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Tanya. And first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to debate those issues. And of course, many things have already been said by the previous speakers on which I would agree. What I wanted to start is by making a bit of a more general reflection about the role of the WTO and WTO reform, and then moving from that more specifically to the question about how to ensure that the sustainability dimension is properly debated and incorporated into the work of the WTO. Now, I think that when one talks about reform in the WTO, there's a lot of focus on issues like how to modernize the rules of the trading system, how to reinforce the monitoring role of the WTO, how to make sure that committees are more effective in tackling the specific trade concerns, and of course, how to fix the dispute settlement system. Now, all of those issues are important, and I'm certainly not in any way neglecting their significance, but I think this is one of the critical functions of the WTO, which is perhaps not sufficiently used. And it is the WTO as a forum for policy deliberation, as a forum for dialogue on those issues that are the concerns of citizens when it comes to the trading system. Because at the end of the day, I think the fundamental challenge that we are facing in countries when we want to maintain and support open trade policies is how to proceed to do with have to do with environmental sustainability, have to do with the social consequences of trade opening. That is have to do with the three dimensions of sustainable development. And what I think is the challenge is how those issues can be properly debated, can be properly deliberated upon in the WTO, not just in terms of the implications for the rules, but in terms of the opportunity for governments to debate and to compare experiences and see how they can better cooperate to achieve and respond to certain challenges. And I think this is relevant for all three dimensions of sustainable development. Let me just give you three examples of what I think the WTO could do better in terms of this deliberation function. Now, if you actually go into the Committee on Trade and Development in the WTO, you will have a lot of discussions about the special differential treatment, what it means in different agreements of the Uruguay round. It's a discussion which, quite frankly, is often a little bit sterile. I mean, at the same time, we are facing a historical moment of integration in the African continent with the African Continental Free Trade Area, which opens, in my view, an extremely important debate about how the global trading system will support the integration of the African continent in trade, and how to ensure a good synergy between this effort and the issues that we are debating in the WTO. I was reading, by the way, a very interesting presentation that was made on this issue by the ex-Deputy Director General of the WTO, Alan Wolf. Now, this is an issue which, in my view, is really important, and it's not the type of issues that you normally discuss in the committees of the WTO. Let me give you a second example. There have been quite a few references to the CBAM, and of course, we fully understand in the European Commission and in the European Union why there's so much interest about this new legislative proposal by the European Commission. And I'm sure that there will be opportunities to debate about the CBAM, for instance, in the Committee on Trade and the Environment, that can be useful in order to foster better understanding and in order to see how to cooperate. I'm not sure that the legalistic type of debate is really going to take us very far. We would obviously argue that what we have done, it is fully consistent with WTO rules. Others may disagree, but this is not the kind of discussion which is really going to take us anywhere in the context of a discussion in a committee. What I think will be a much more interesting type of conversation, it is an opportunity to explain why us and other countries are concerned about the issue of carbon leakage, an opportunity to explain how we are designing the instrument to fulfill that objective, and an opportunity to hear what are the concerns of others. And it's that kind of dialogue which actually can generate better understanding, that kind of identify avenues for cooperation. And then I think, Tanya, I come, of course, to the issue which I know that you will be particularly interested. What about the third dimensions of sustainable development? What about trade and labor? What about trade and social development? I think it's a profound mistake that this has become a little bit of a taboo in the WTO. If you actually look at the political debate about trade policy in most countries, it is about the social consequences of trade opening. It is how to ensure inclusiveness. It is how to ensure that the people who may be negatively affected by trade, there can be ways of actually supporting them. I mean, those are the issues which are at the core of the debate on trade policies in most countries, and those are issues which at this point in time you don't really discuss about them in the WTO. I think it's a mistake. I think it is something that, in my view, if the WTO wants to be relevant, it would need to find a way to also exercise its policy deliberation function to talk about the social consequence of trade. How to do it? I mean, I think there have been a number of interesting ideas that have been mentioned around the table. I certainly think that one very important element would be WTO ILO cooperation. This is to see, for instance, the WTO and the ILO cooperating in analyzing the certain dimensions of the trade implications, of the social development implications of trade policies. And then one would need to see in what fora within the WTO those issues can be debated. Now, I'm not going to make any specific proposal at this point in time, but the main point which I wanted to make is that I believe that the role of the WTO as a forum for policy deliberation is extremely important. It is something which, in my view, is somehow neglected, and that issues relating to the interface between trade and social development have to be part of that conversation if you want to be sure that the WTO is seen as being relevant and is seen as being discussing the concerns of citizens, not only in the European Union, but I say in all countries in the world.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and to all our first speakers, really just setting, I think, a brilliant scene, in particular to have a very strong, testimony on why it is so important to have an inclusive and comprehensive view. we are currently collecting some of the questions, but let me maybe play the devil's advocate for one moment. And I would like to put that question to all four of you and just ask you for a very, very quick answer. Because I have also been following a couple of other sessions. And I know that we are always, when we arguing for a comprehensive view on environment, labor, and trade all together, that there is strong interlinkage, we're always confronted with the notion, some of course comes from developing countries, saying we should keep each separated, and trade is trade and should remain trade and only be left in the WTO, then labor with the ILO, and environment and the UN bodies. So what would your one-line reply be to that challenge of what we just had testified for? May I ask you, Ambassador, because it would be very interesting to know how we can actually also bring a loop in that, that criticism and actually answer with a positive reply. Thank you.
Well, it's simply not sustainable. And I think what we learned from the pandemic just most recently is that multilateral problems and issues require a multilateral response and multi-institutional response. I mean, that is one of the lessons that we take away from the pandemic. And so to say that we have to stay in our silo, to use Karen's analogy, is not going to get us any of the results that we need. Now, it is true the WTO is a rulemaking organization, but as Ignacio points out, it should be more than that, and it should be a forum where we can talk about policy, because policy development is the first step that you need to take in order to get to a rulemaking phase. And this is the thing that we find exciting about TESTI and the structured discussions, because within the organization, we have to start that discussion with the coalition of the willing. We have to start that discussion with those that want to have that type of debate. And I think what's exciting about TESTI as well is it's brought in other international organizations, other stakeholders to participate in that discussion and to inform that debate. And I don't have any illusions that all of this is going to result in multilateral rulemaking, but it is an important discussion to have. And my hope is as well that as the discussion develops, interest will increase, and that comment that you made, which I believe is true, or the observation that you made about those who wish to see the WTO stay within its silo, will start to break down as a function of these types of discussions.
Thank you very much for the clear response. Maybe perhaps to add also from Karen, Emmanuel, and Ignacio. Karen in particular, because I think those challenges come particular to bringing in labor into the WTO. What would be your response to that question in one or two lines? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. And it's very difficult to add very much to the ambassador. And I fully support what he has said. I think also we need to pick up what Ignacio said, which was indeed that at the country level, where the debate is, where the political debate is a holistic one. It is not saying just, yes, please just go ahead with trade and don't think about the social aspects and don't think about the environmental aspects, and as you can see also in the bilateral trade negotiations, that all of these aspects are also being brought in regularly. So the question is this a time to face the reality and understand that there is a need to respond to the electorate, to the people that are expecting trade to deliver. And in that respect, I think that a good place to start is indeed by the brainstorming, by having people at the table who are willing to open up the reflections and think about it in a holistic way, to discuss how to best respond and deliver in that respect. Coming from the ILO, I think that the ILO has already worked, of course, with the WTO on joint research, but that joint research can be used as a foundation then perhaps to moving more in depth, to looking at the impact of trade, not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively, potentially in particular sectors, to have something concrete to be part of the discussion by the players that are interested, perhaps from their different silos, but being able to engage together and look at how that can be best reflected in moving forward, and without making the decisions of how one would then move forward. 2 years ago, I think I was at the forum also with the ESC, and it was floated this idea of a working group where the ILO could be present and inclusive engagement of stakeholders to look at trade and decent work, or let's say broadly perhaps trade, decent work, environment under the Sustainable Development Goals angle, which of course all member states, whether of the ILO or of the WTO, are all very much in agreement, to have that first really building of the innovative and ambitious reflections to see how to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. But also the same question to Emmanuel, because sometimes I hear that also from, let's say, from the business community, not to overboard trade and just let trade be trade. What would be your response in particular, because with all the experience that you do have, how much the interlinkage, for instance, happens at global supply chains, that we actually can very difficultly advocate for keeping them separate? Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, for the question. I think that the answer has been given already by Ambassador De Boer. It is very clear that with the huge economic and social impact of the sanitary crisis, it is clear for every country, industrialized and developing countries, that we should foster international cooperation between international organization, and that every dimension, economic trade, I mean, some people maybe have died because of export restriction on vaccine, on PPE. We have faced many disruption in the global supply chains of the health products and vaccines. So here you understand immediately that the trade-related aspects are linked to the equitable distribution, and now the issue is the production of vaccine, because nobody will be out of the crisis if still some countries have not access to the vaccine. And this is really one of the big parts in the very recent ICC global business priorities for the WTO, this need to have a coherent and consistent trade and health policy. It is really one of the priority of the businesses. And another aspect regarding developing countries, I mean, we have a lot of preferential agreements. We have at the EU level GSP agreement, and in these FTAs, in the agreements, there are developments, there are sustainable development chapters. In some of them, for the GSP, there are conditionalities in terms of human rights and sustainability. So it is a way to liaise, to introduce a linkage between the preferential trade advantage that you will give, that means zero tariff, zero quota, and in exchange, you are encouraging, of course, better governance and a good behavior in the field of human rights. So I think that these are two examples really showing that it is no more possible for developing countries, I think, to say that these two dimensions, these two trade systems should be kept separately.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. And also the same question to Ignacio, but maybe with the additional twist, because we as an ESC, in all our opinions, of course, we want the EU also to be very ambitious in the multilateral sphere. So on the one hand, how can we challenge that that statement that I brought up, but also with the positive action to show what the EU can actually do with some of the examples that we heard at the multilateral level, and to show how it is possible to bring in those dimensions. And maybe just one of the examples. I know that you're of course very much familiar with the recent US proposal to putting forced labor together in the fisheries subsidies negotiations. So I think is that a way forward to bring this in and also to contest the statement that I've just made? Thank you.
Sorry. No, thanks a lot. And of course, I would agree very much on what the previous speakers have said. Let me make 2 comments and then go concretely into the issue that you have raised. What can be done concretely in the WTO, particularly on the issues relating to trade and labor, trade and social development, which I guess is really what you want me to engage with. Now, the first comment which I would make, I don't think I can recall any debate in which I have participated on trade policy with the member states, with the European Parliament, with the stakeholders, in which it was purely a discussion about trade in a silo. That's not the way that trade is being discussed in the European Union. That's not the way that trade is being discussed in countries around the world. It is always trade as it interfaces with the issues that concern the citizens, which it is economic development, which it is sustainability, which it is the social consequences of liberalization. Those are the issues which are really debated. And if those issues cannot be discussed in the WTO, because the WTO is strictly about market access and nothing but market access, then I think that, quite frankly, the WTO is not an institution of the 21st century. So I think the question is, so that would be my first comment. The second one, I think there's a bit of an obsession about rules in the WTO. I think the only way to have a meaningful action in the WTO is to negotiate new rules, to develop rules. Now, negotiating rules, developing rules is a very demanding exercise. It's something that can only be the consequence of a sufficient, strong consensus and sense that certain rules need to be developed, multilaterally or plurilaterally. But there are so many things on which it would be important for the WTO as an institution to have a role to play, which do not imply that there is any question at this point in time of developing new rules or being involved in a rule type of exercise. And I think that sometimes I perceive that the concerns about bringing certain issues into a discussion in the WTO is that it's immediately being seen, okay, this is the first step, because the next step is going to be to develop rules about the matter. And I think that we need to be able to look much more into the WTO as a forum for deliberation, totally independently to the question of whether or not there's a need to develop the rules of international trade on a particular topic. So then going concretely, what could be done to foster the consideration of social development, labor issues in the WTO? First, we certainly think it has been a good initiative by the United States to bring the issue of forced labor into the fisheries subsidies negotiations, and to do it in a very careful manner, which is not affecting the rights and obligations of the countries that would be subscribing to this agreement, but which at the same time clearly signals the importance of the issue. So we are clearly supporting this initiative of the United States. But beyond these specific initiatives, as I said, for us, I think the critical issue is going to be how to begin to normalize a discussion about trade and social development within the framework of the WTO. We would certainly attach a lot of importance about the possibility of cooperation between the ILO and the WTO, about the possibility of joint analysis, particularly of themes which are of interest not only for countries in the north, but also countries in the south. The more that this is something which is well focused and that can be a subject for a thematic discussion in the WTO, I think this is something that we would very, very much favor. It can be done in the General Council. Of course, ideally it would be good to have a working group that is looking into this issue, but that might be a step too far at this point in time. You can discuss in the General Council. You can discuss in the Committee of Regional Trade Agreements. I mean, as has been mentioned, so many free trade agreements have chapters on sustainable development, including the labor dimension. Would it be a good idea for countries that participate in those agreements to explain how the these chapters are being implemented, what are the type of issues which are being debated. You have the trade policy review of countries. It is also an opportunity for countries to explain how the social dimensions of trade are being handled at the domestic level. So there are many different ways in which these issues can be discussed, can be deliberated in the WTO. And I think what will be important is to break the taboo that this is not an issue that can be discussed in the WTO because it's somehow outside the mandate of the WTO. So I think it's a very reductionist approach to the matter from my point of view.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. We have now been collecting a couple of questions, and maybe I would like to loop into the next and maybe already the final round of discussion. If not, I still have a final question for all four of you. For instance, the discussion that we currently have going on, one question, and of course it has been specifically said, maybe very provocatively say, is there enough global consensus to actually achieve that? Or could that be, as it was said also by the ambassador, say, let's start also with a coalition of the willing and to start and hopefully then to make the argument. But one subject that has not yet been raised in that sense, and I would like to bring that in, and feel free, whoever of you would like to come back to that question. What can the WTO change in its works to actually to get small farmers on board supporting international trade? And that links also very much to the other comment that we had received when the argument is made, we really have to go local. So far we have very much, as Ignacio had said, we have been at a level of international multilateral rules, but what is in the change on the ground and how we can actually going local in that sense. And that also, because food was mentioned there, and I think also with small farmers, the whole issue of sustainable food supply chains is all links together also with the point that Emmanuel wanted maybe to come back in on the global supply chain. So I would put forward those, let's say, those elements of questions to you, and whoever would like to come in on a specific one, please just indicate. And then I would have a final question for you before we are closing the session in some 10 minutes. Who would like to go first? In particular, I think the farmer question is rather specific.
So Delphine said I could go. I wanted to say two things. Before I talk about the farmer question, I did want to note, I don't disagree with what Ignacio is saying about the WTO as a policy forum, but I would also say that the introduction of rules and the discussion around rules can be enormously useful. And I would note that now that the Services Domestic Regulation text has been essentially agreed to, we have for the first time baked into an agreement and created a rule with respect to gender equality. And so, and Canada proposed that rule, so that's one reason why I'm very proud of it. But putting the rule forward and then having a discussion about the rule and how it applies and why is it important was enormously useful in order to bring about change within the WTO. And it has been agreed to for those members that are part of that JSI. So there is scope for rulemaking, and the WTO can change in positive ways and move forward. With respect to the question around small farmers, look, we have a missed opportunity here. We could actually be addressing these issues if we change the channel somewhat. We are engaged in agriculture negotiations here, and we're following a pretty static format of 7 pillars of the negotiations. But if we change the channel and said, let's talk about sustainability and sustainable development, or let's talk about food security, then you can have a different debate, and it's one that's perfectly fits within the mandate of the WTO, but it's a different way of looking at rulemaking, and it's a different way of trying to achieve a result. I think we understand that domestic support, for example, is enormously damaging to small farmers, to sustainable development. And it could be enormously damaging to food security. So rather than just talking about reductions in domestic support, because we think it's a macroeconomic problem or an economic problem that needs to be addressed, we could be talking about it in different ways to get results. So there are opportunities absolutely within the WTO to have that discussion that would help small farmers, that would address food security and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Emmanuel, would you like to come in on the supply chain angle again?
Thank you, Tanja. So of course, yes, this issue of the global supply chain and maybe more generally, the global value chain, which are not exactly the same thing, because the value, of course, is wider than the supply, the fact to supply. So here, during the crisis, of course, there have been a lot of examples of unresilient and inefficient global supply chains, not only for the health products and medicine and PPE, but in other fields. So now it is very clear for the global businesses that there is a double duty for the future, not only to be sure that these global chains, they are efficient and they will be more efficient in terms of time to market and quality control and protection of the IP, and of course, long-standing relationship with the suppliers, but they have to be, on top of that, resilient. So there is a kind of scoping exercise for most of them in order to identify what has been dysfunctional, what should be corrected. And of course, in the EU again, with the perspective of a law on due diligence that will apply not only for the activities of the companies, we don't know yet what will be the threshold. In France, we have a law since 2017, and this law covers companies having more than 5,000 employees in France and more than 10,000 in the world. But we don't know yet what will be the threshold for the new EU proposal. But it's interesting in the sense that this future proposal will cover not only the activities of the EU companies, but also the activities in their supply chain, Tanja, as you know very well. So of course, it will be a new challenge. And I think this is a very interesting, difficult and promising challenge. And once again, it will be very important to be able to report, to be able to share best practices, but also difficulties that the companies are experiencing with their suppliers in doing so. Can we do that at multilateral level? Will it be possible to have a workshop to exchange these experiences and difficulties? I think it will be really useful to obtain progress on the ground.
Thank you very much. I have seen indicating, Ignacio, that you also would like to comment on that question, but maybe let me ask the final question to all four of you, and then you can loop it in. And apologies in advance, I know this is not in your job profiles, but please let us be revolutionary for one moment. So what would be the one single action that you would like to see the WTO take to start implementing and to take the path forward on what we have just discussed on more conclusive, more comprehensive, really in getting the quest around on the sustainability? And this time I'm starting with the backwards order, starting with you, Ignacio.
Well, before answering your question, let me just comment on something that Stephen said, just to clarify that, of course, I'm not in any way implying that one should not try to mainstream into rules negotiations elements relating to sustainability. It seems to me that any negotiation which is going to take place in the WTO at this point in time, where it is rules, where it is market access, inevitably is going to have to mainstream a sustainability dimension. So I would certainly very much agree, and I think that what has happened on domestic services regulation is a good signal. I hope there will be agreement in the future these negotiations to incorporate the element of forced labor. Let's see how the structural discussions on the environment evolve. But I mean, I think from our perspective, looking again into liberalization of environmental goods and services is something that will be a positive contribution that the WTO can make towards sustainability. But coming back to the question of trade and social development, what I would see as being an important step would be, as I said, a joint study by the ILO and the WTO about, I will not actually identify the topic. I think I will be quite happy for the ILO and the WTO to discuss what they think could be the specific topic that would attract more interest and more attention to, as I said, both in the North and in the South, and to have on that basis a good policy dialogue, I would say, in the General Council. Ideally, of course, I would think it would be a great idea to have a working group in the WTO that looks into trade and social development in the same way that we have a working group that looks into trade and environment, but perhaps that's something that may take a little bit longer for this idea to be generally accepted by members in the WTO.
Okay, we have a first step, very briefly, because now we're really running out of time. Emmanuel, what would be the one single action that you would like to see?
Well, I think we are waiting for a positive signal at the MC12 in terms of trade and environment for the business priority. It is really one of the most important business priority. And I will add that we will need a kind of further degree of professionalization in the way WTO is able to include the civil society. WTO is very late compared to OECD in its capacity to work with the civil society, to work with employers, trade associations. For instance, I'm referring to the guidelines on due diligence that have been carried out by the OECD with the support of the civil society. Maybe here WTO can learn from the example of the OECD.
Well, thank you very much for that example. I've seen the post that we have to wrap up, but Karen, in one sentence, what would be your message? And then immediately going to Ambassador de Boer.
Thanks very much, Tanya. So I'll just to support then what Ignacio said, a joint WTO study that will be used as a discussion and debate within the WTO to thinking about further breaking down these silos, and maybe just throw out a possibility of trade on gender equality, the impact of trade on gender equality, given the good work done by Canada to already put that forward in the rules. Thank you.
Ambassador, you have the final word.
So I would like an agreement on fish by MC12 so we can meet SDG 14.6. It is about sustainable development. It's about 14.6 and we have to get it over the finish line. That would build credibility in the organization to actually talk about sustainable development.
Well, thank you so much to our four panelists who really, I think, paint a very rich picture on where we have to go with some concrete steps. Final words on my side. I thank you very much also to the audience, both in the room and those connected remotely. And please follow also the opinions of the ESC in particular on trade. I think we have some very good proposals from a civil society perspective. So keep all safe and enjoy the rest of the public forum. Thank you very much.